So welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the keynote session with Professor Ivette Perfecto. My name is Laura Morillas, and I am the research manager at the Center for Sustainable Food Systems at UBC Farm. And I am also the coordinator of the Diversified Agroecosystems Research Cluster in UBC, who is sponsoring this event. As we begin, first of all, I would like to acknowledge that many of us work normally at the UBC's Vancouver campus, which is situated on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people. Because of the pandemic, I am right now joining the event from my house in Vancouver, which is located in the traditional territory of the three Coast Salish peoples, and these are Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and the Musqueam peoples. Each of you are joining us today from many different places, and I would also like to acknowledge the traditional caretakers of those lands. So please take a moment to reflect on whose territories do you currently reside, and how are you accountable to the people of those lands. If you don't know whose territories you are on, we encourage you to learn more about it. One way you can do this is by exploring the link that my colleague Jessica is just gonna throw in the chat right now. She just did. And I would like to say that personally, and actually as an immigrant in this land, I am deeply grateful and respectful of those who voluntarily or not are now sharing the land with me. Okay, so once we said that, I would like to also mention that this webinar is sponsored by, again, the Diversified Agroecosystem Research Cluster, funded by the UBC VPRI office. This research cluster is an international and multidisciplinary network of researchers working to create actionable science to achieve sustainable agriculture that can feed the world while cooling the planet, while also protecting biodiversity and promoting food sovereignty. The cluster is hosted as UBC's Center for Sustainable Food Systems, or CSFS for short, because you will hear this word a lot during today, which is a teaching and research center, as well as a local to global food hub, working towards a more sustainable, food secure future. And now about this seminar, today's webinar is titled Generating a More Holistic Understanding of the Risk of Pandemics. Dr. Ivette Perfecto, our keynote speaker, will discuss the importance of integrating ecological, social, and political factors to have a holistic understanding of the risks associated to pandemics as the one that we are living right now. A few housekeeping details. After the presentation, we are going to have some time for discussion, and Hannah Whitman is going to moderate that discussion. So if you have questions for the speaker, please feel free to add your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your Zoom control panel and share them with all of us. And also feel free to upvote others' questions by clicking on the thumbs up symbol, so we have an opportunity to know what questions have more interest for everyone. And now I'm gonna finally talk about our speaker, Dr. Ivette Perfecto, one of our amazing international cluster members. Dr. Perfecto is a professor at the School of Natural Resources and Environment at the University of Michigan, with 30 years of experience working on issues of agriculture, biodiversity, and the environment, and 25 years teaching courses on these topics at the University of Michigan. Her research focuses on agroecology and biodiversity conservation. And among many other merits, Professor Perfecto was one of the lead coordinating authors of the United Nations International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science, and Technology for Development. And she's also an elected fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science and the Ecological Society of America. And she does all this while being a lovely colleague to work with. And with this, Ivette, the floor is all yours. And we are all ears right now.
Thank you, Laura. Let me share my screen. Let's see. Can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay.
Perfect.
So thank you very much, first of all, for the invitation. This is the second time that I participate in the activities of the cluster, the symposium, and it's always very interesting to hear what you guys are doing, and all the perspectives that you bring to the discussions on biodiversity and agriculture, which is like my passion. So my talk today is entitled Biodiversity, Agriculture, and Pandemics, Perspectives from a Scholar Activist. Given the title of my talk, especially the scholar activist part of it, I decided to start with a brief a personal story, my journey to being a scholar activist. Growing up in Puerto Rico, I developed a political consciousness early on. Puerto Rico is a colony of the United States, and living in Puerto Rico feels like, well, living in a colony. In high school, I joined the pro-independence movement and began to be politically active. And I also developed a love for nature and decided to study biology. Now, during all my undergraduate career, I was a pro-independence activist and a biology student, but those two lives were completely separate from one another. When I arrived in the United States, I discovered an organization called Science for the People, a group of scientists devoted to using their science for the benefit of the more marginalized people in society. And out of that group emerged another group of ecologists, and a few epidemiologists were part of that group as well, that were interested in basically examining or using the science of ecology to the benefit of developing more sustainable agriculture and more just agricultural system. And that group was called the New World, or is called the New World Agriculture and Ecology Group. And some of you out there, I know, are members of NUAG. Okay, so a very influential figure in my formation as a politically conscientious scientist was Richard Levins. Levins was married to a Puerto Rican poet, Rosario Morales. He was a strong advocate for Puerto Rican independence and lived in Puerto Rico until the University of Puerto Rico denied him tenure for political reasons. When I was a student in Puerto Rico, I did not know him personally, but I had heard all these stories about the gringo professor who was very active in the pro-independence movement and against the Vietnam War during that time. Little did I know that he was considered to be one of the founding fathers of modern ecology. Dick was a member of Science for the People and NUAC, and I met him here in Michigan when I came to graduate school here. Richard Levins, as I mentioned to you, was kicked out of the University of Puerto Rico for his pro-independence activism, and then came to the United States, University of Chicago, and then University of, then Harvard University. So Levins basically, he was involved, as I mentioned before. I'm sorry, I got distracted with the phone. He was involved in the pro-independence movement in Puerto Rico, and little did I know that he was such an illustrious ecologist, and basically he merged his ecology and his political activism. And that's when I realized that I didn't need to have this split personality as a scientist and a political activist. The Dialectical Biology's book that he wrote with his colleague Lewontin became a guide to me to being a scholar activist. Now, what is a scholar activist? Well, according to June Borras from the Institute of Social Science or Social Studies at Erasmus University in the Netherlands, scholar activists are those who explicitly aim not only to interpret the world in a scholarly way, but to change it, and who are connected with a political project or social justice-oriented movement. Now, being a scholar activist is what attracted me to the field of agroecology, because agroecology is not only about the scientific ecological principles behind sustainable agriculture systems, but it's also about the livelihoods of the farmers and about the right of the farmers to maintain their way of life, and about social, environmental, and racial justice. So for about 40 years, since I first came to the United States, I have been working in this space. Here are some pictures from my past in a biodiversity course in Nicaragua, where some farmers participate, and then in a Via Campesina conference in Malaga, Spain, and finally at the Zapatista Conciencia meeting that was organized in San Cristobal de las Casas in Mexico. Now, more recently, I joined the board of the Agroecology and Rural Economics Research Corps and began working with the Pandemic Research for the People, a project of AREC that was founded by Rob Wallace, who is an epidemiologist, scholar, activist. PrEP was formed at the onset of COVID-19 to get research efforts underway to answer questions that could help communities around the world during the ongoing pandemic. It is composed of farmers and academics and addresses questions that go from the very practical, immediate issues like what is the best way to form and safely operate neighborhood brigades, checking up on people house to house while we are in quarantine, to more longer term issues like could we plan agricultural landscapes that self-regulate in such a way that the deadliest pathogens are far less likely to emerge in the first place. And given my background in agroecology, this is the question that I have been exploring with the PrEP group. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic infused new interest in understanding the role of agriculture in infectious diseases. Ecologists in particular have been very active in the last few years in this area, especially in what concerns the effect of land use change, mainly conversion of forest to agriculture on spillovers and transmission of infectious diseases. Although it is important that we understand infectious diseases from a broader ecological context, ecological studies that are divorced from their historical, political, social, and economic context can arrive to simplistic generalizations and erroneous conclusions. And they can also reproduce long-standing colonial notions of people and their landscapes. The literature of land use change and infectious diseases is filled with simplistic assumptions. Well, among them, first, in general, when you read this literature, what you get from this literature, with some exceptions, of course, is that conversion of forest to agriculture leads to biodiversity loss, that the loss of diversity leads to increase in reservoir host density, and that high host density increases the probability of spillover from wild host to humans, or to domestic animals and then to humans. When presented in this simplistic fashion, these assumptions frequently lead to embracing a land-sparing approach to biodiversity and food production. In other words, further intensifying agriculture in the name of natural habitat conservation. And now we're adding to that disease control, no? So we're going kind of back to the old notion of the separation of humans and nature under the rubric of biosecurity. Here's an example of this approach. This is a paper that was published in Nature last year by Gibbs and colleagues. Using the PREDICT database, they concluded that anthropogenic pressures upon forest ecosystem both homogenize host diversity and selects for specific species that are also viral host. And they noted global change in the mode and intensity of land use are creating expanding hazardous interfaces between people, livestock, and wildlife reservoirs of zoonotic diseases. Now, this is an important finding. Don't get me wrong. This is really an important finding. Linking land use, change, science, ecology, and epidemiology is a critical step toward developing a more robust understanding of zoonotic diseases. But the authors omit the historical specificities, political economy, and agroecological dynamics of land use change and their implications for disease ecologies. So in pandemic research for the people, we argue that those factors are essential for understanding zoonoses and how to develop agricultural landscapes that can minimize zoonosis and pandemics. As Richard Levins used to say, always ask, where is the rest of the world? This was a favorite phrase of him. Where is the rest of the world? What else is going on that we're ignoring? In a very nice article that was published by Sophie van Becke and her colleagues, they argue that the multifactorial determinants of the complex ecological systems of infectious diseases should be better acknowledged, and that the disease ecology would benefit from a more nuanced consideration of land use systems. And to that, we add the need to acknowledge historical specificities and political economy. So uneven development and capital expansion produce pathogenic ecosystems. By discussing land use dynamics historically, researchers separate the relationship between disease ecologies and land use change from the very dynamics of capital investment, international trade, and socioeconomic crisis that drive trends in peri-urbanization, expansion of tropical commodity plantations, and forest destruction. The collapse of forest ecosystems, loss of biodiversity, and human-animal spillover events are situated in specific localities. We cannot, isolate them. They are situated in specific localities with specific conditions, but also reflect broader trends in resource extraction, international capital investment, interclass conflicts, and agribusiness long-standing exploitation of surrounding resource space and peasant communities. Forest transitions are the product of broader patterns of capitalist development, colonialism, and more recently, neoliberalism. So an example is the Ebola epidemic in Western Africa. This is a good example of how an epidemic connects to neoliberalism. And Rob Wallace have elaborated a lot in this particular case study. The disease has been present intermittently since 1976, as shown in this map here. In 2014, Ebola shifted from an intermittent forest killer to a proto-pandemic infection that infected about 27,000 people, killing over 11,000 people across Western Africa. So the outbreak, the 2014 outbreak, was primarily concentrated here in Western Africa. The Ebola hot zone as a whole comprised a part of what is called the larger Guinean savanna zone that the World Bank described as one of the largest underused agricultural land reserves in the world. And the World Bank promote efforts for opening the forest to global circuits of capital. And this opening up of this area have resulted in the establishment of large commodity plantations, including oil palm plantations. With the abandonment of trans fat, with the abandonment of the use of trans fats, palm oil have become very popular and represent a growing market, with global exports totaling 75.5 million metric tons this year and covering an area of 18.5 million hectares worldwide. Now, disturbance-associated fruit bats and insectivorous bats are attracted to oil palm plantations. They migrate to oil palms for food and shelter from the heat, while the plantations, they use also the trails of the plantation for movement that, those trails permit very easy movement between roosting and foraging sites. And they are all potential reservoirs or carriers of the Ebola virus. The Guéckédou area was ground zero for the Ebola outbreak of 2014. And the landscape in that area is a mosaic of villages surrounded by dense vegetation and interspersed by large oil palm plantations. And this map, you can see them in the red dots there, or the red areas, and patches of open forest and regenerated young forest. Now, this has increased the interface between humans and bats, increasing the probability of spillover and likely leading to the outbreak. Furthermore, structural adjustment programs to which the West African countries have been subjected to for the past decade or so, included the kinds of the divestment from public health infrastructure and support that permitted Ebola to incubate and spread even faster. The other important point that needs to be taken into consideration when looking at zoonosis and land use change is that not all agriculture is the same. There is agriculture and there is agriculture, no? West Africa, for example, people in West Africa have been cultivating red oil palm for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Locally, the oil palm holds cultural importance for nutrition. But oil palm has been produced in small-scale traditional agroforestry systems combined with coconut palm and other fruit trees. This is a traditional agroforestry farm in Nigeria that has a bunch of different kinds of fruit trees in addition to the oil palm. And this is a more modern agroforestry plantation in Ivory Coast that have, oil palm along with other kinds of trees. Agroecologists have long differentiated among the ecological, social, and economic aspects of, on the one hand, indigenous peasant production, and on the other hand, latifundia production and extractivist agrobusiness, like we see in these two pictures here. In the context of zoonosis, an important concept is that of the agroecological matrix, which is the managed area where fragments of forests are embedded. The agricultural matrix through which a pathogen has to move to reach a critical host population density, an area of a critical host population density of humans can be conceived of as a good or a bad incubator of pathogens and as a good or a bad barrier for the pathogen. So this is something that my lab group is beginning to look into and trying to develop this idea. So, these are not really well formed ideas yet. We're in the process of developing some of these. So the matrix as an incubator and a barrier. A good incubator matrix is one that facilitates or increases the probability of a spillover event from wildlife to a human host. And a bad barrier matrix is one that facilitates or increases the probability of transmission from human to human. The current paradigm treats agriculture as a homogeneous entity. No, when people talk about agriculture, it's like agriculture. All agriculture is bad. It leads, to deforestation, which leads to higher density of the host and higher spillover probability. No. As I mentioned before, this is a very simplistic view, which tends to predominate the discussion of zoonosis and land use change. They assume agriculture destroy wildlife habitat and reduce biodiversity, favoring pathogens, host populations, and increasing the probability of spillover of pathogens to humans, who will eventually bring it to centers of high population density and spread from there, causing then a pandemic. But the reality is that the matrix is complex, no? We can conceive of a low quality matrix as one that is a good incubator and a low barrier for the pathogen. It increases the probability of spillover events and increases also the transmission from human to human, reaching centers of critical population density. That's one extreme. No, on the other extreme, or on the other hand, we can have a high quality matrix that would be one that is a bad incubator for the pathogen and a good barrier. No, by maintaining high diversity at the landscape level, it reduces the probability of spillover events and reduces transmission from human to human, preventing the pathogen from reaching centers of crucial population density. Of course, it is not as simple as that either, because there are many different factors that contribute to landscape being a good or a bad incubator and a good or a bad barrier of pathogens. But at least we can begin by distinguishing different kinds of matrices and analyzing these with respect to the characteristics that could make them good or bad incubator, good or bad barriers for pathogens. Here, for example, we have a gradient of agricultural intensification at the landscape level, going from, an agroforestry matrix or shifting cultivation type of matrix to this mixed green revolution type of agriculture, to this large, extensive, monocultural plantations, some of which have labor camps like this one, or some of which are mechanized. Obviously, these different matrices are going to have different effect as incubators and as barriers potentially of pathogens. So distinguishing between different kinds of matrices will allow us to analyze the socio-ecological characteristics that make these matrices good or bad incubators and good or bad barriers. No, for example, here we have shifting cultivation. Then we can zoom in, see this type of matrix and analyze it and say, okay, well, the disturbances are intermediate but transient, since each agricultural plot is left to fallow, mostly dominated by small-scale farms. A landscape is dominated by secondary forests and is heterogeneous and dynamic. Agricultural plots tend to be diverse. Within the agricultural plots, there's a lot of agrobiodiversity, and dominated by annual crops. Biodiversity is maintained at the landscape level, etc., etc. Food security tend to be high because people are producing their own food for the most part, etc., etc. Now we can look at those characteristics. Here's an example of the green revolution, mixed green revolution type a landscape, like in Punjab, India. And so let's analyze it. What kind of landscape is this? What are the characteristics that might lead to a high incubation, high probability of incubation of the pathogens? and to the transmission of the pathogen. The same thing for the monocultural plantation, high labor monocultural plantation. Disturbance is high, biodiversity is low, food security is low. There's the human population is high and tend to be concentrated because of the labor camps, etc., etc. No, I should also say that my lab, I mentioned this, my lab is just beginning this analysis, and we don't have a lot in terms of data. And the next step is to gather some empirical data to examine locations of outbreaks of actual outbreaks of zoonoses, and categorize that the matrix, no, to see where they fall and see what are the characteristics of this matrix that led to this outbreak. The other thing that I should mention, or I should add, is that the incubator and barrier properties of a landscape can vary with different reservoir host. So depending on the host that you're looking at, this is gonna change. For example, rodents can benefit a lot from having cereal agriculture. So if you have a lot of corn and this kind of cereals that can lead to a high population of the rodents, then that type of host is going to benefit from that kind of agriculture, while fruit bats might benefit from having fruit plantations. No, so depending on what are the hosts that are carrying the pathogen, the matrix could be good or bad, depending on the host. And in finishing, I would say that in mainstream ecology, the notion is emerging that viruses seem to stem from unruly, unplanned spaces and people in the global south. This leads to growing calls for implementing surveillance methods, not just in rural areas, but also in urban areas. And this was one of the main recommendations that came from the Guéckédou article that I mentioned before. These are draconian policies or policy mechanisms that originate mostly in the global north, with the help and collaboration of neocolonial counterparts in the global south. These notions also tend to favor land-sparing approaches to conservation, as I mentioned before. We argue that linking land use change science, ecology, and epidemiology is a critical step toward developing a more robust understanding of zoonotic diseases, but ignoring the historical specificities, political economy, and agroecological dynamics of land use change and their implications for disease ecology can lead to making erroneous inferences. We also call for a more nuanced approach that will distinguish between different kinds of agriculture. Not all agriculture is the same. And we need to overlay that with an understanding of the history of the place and the political economic analysis. And finally, furthermore, we argue for increased investment in agroecological research that promotes more socially continuous interventions in zoonotic pathogens. So with that, I'm going to leave it here because I think that we want to have some discussion. So I'll leave it here and open it up for any questions that you may have. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ivette. That was an amazing talk.
Thank you.
This was lovely. We have quite a few people thinking about questions to ask. I think I'll just start off by asking, part of what we're discussing in our cluster as a whole is just exactly what you're talking about, these very narrow visions of what agriculture is and can be. And so, I think we see a lot of consumer interest now in supporting these more diversified agroecosystems. Consumers are interested in supporting the kind of agriculture that feeds people and How do we make that jump from growing social interest in supporting agroecology and sustainable agriculture to influencing the policies that would produce the kind of agricultural matrices that you're describing here as healthier for people and nature?
Yeah, well, that jump to the policy. We start with the analysis and all that, and then we can't stop there. No, you need to influence policymakers, and that's part of the activism component. No, so working with organizations that are doing that kind of work, activist type of work, pushing politicians. I see it as two levels. On the one hand, there's the policy realm, which is important, and there are policymakers, and they need to be informed, and they need to be pushed to do the right thing, no? And there are many organizations that are really good at doing that and pushing the politicians to do that. So that's an important component. But on the other hand, there's also the people the farmers that are doing this kind of agriculture and all that, and that I think that working with farmer organizations is also extremely important. I know that people are kind of losing their trust and confidence that we can actually change things from the top down with politicians. I think that's a generalized phenomenon in the world right now, that people are losing confidence, even from, including left-wing governments. We have a lot of experiences in Latin America with left-wing governments, and they, for one reason or another, they don't seem to deliver that much. And so people are basically trying to find solutions by themselves. And there are a lot of coalitions that have been formed or are being formed between consumers and producers. So those links between the consumers and the farmers are extremely important. I see that growing in Puerto Rico, for example. It's a very strong movement there to link the consumers with the producers. But those kinds of things, I think, are kind of yielding a little bit better results, even though it's at a small scale, and they seem to be all scattered all over the place, but not as visible, as the changes that come from the top down, but they seem to be pretty effective, at least at the local level.
A really interesting point. I was thinking about what's going on in Brazil right now, that from the top, at the stroke of a pen, they're opening up indigenous reserves to mining, and which is a very visible top-down change. But at the same time, you have this very broad network of civil society organizations doing lots of things in many places that possibly is actually making a bigger impact on the landscape. So that's a really interesting point. Yeah. Claire Kremen has a question, so we're going to go to her next. I think she can unmute herself.
Hi, Claire.
Hi, Yvette. How are you?
Good.
Oh, I guess I can. Well, you see my photo.
Yeah.
So I was actually trying to formulate my question, and so first I want to thank you for your awesome presentation. And I'm so excited to hear about the new direction your lab is taking. I think it's such an important problem to to nuance this issue of agriculture in promoting or preventing emerging infectious disease, as well as the socio-ecological context. And so it's so exciting to hear that you're doing this. And as you know, I share your interest in agroecology and agricultural landscapes that both depend on and support biodiversity. But I've always been worried about when we have those kinds of landscapes, those much more shared landscapes that are much more supportive of biodiversity, we could also have greater incidence of human-wildlife conflict. And then this emerging infectious disease is just one part of that. And I haven't quite gotten to the part of my question. What is my question? I guess I just feel like we're still so not knowing about the relationships between the diversity of organisms that might inhabit these shared landscapes, and how they influence the emerging infectious diseases. That is, like the dilution hypothesis seems to work on some in some diseases and not in others, and so it just seems like a really, really complicated issue. And I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on how we go forward when we have a lot of lack of information in trying to figure out what is the best way to mitigate human wildlife conflict / emerging infectious diseases in these shared landscapes?
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that we have been grappled with with in our group, because as you say, it's not true that always a higher diversity is necessarily going to lead to less probability of a spillover event, so there are examples where that's not the case. So how do you deal with that, and or try to find some generalizations? That's the problem, because if you look at one specific case where you know who the vector is, or the host is and all that, then there's enough that you can use in terms of knowledge of general ecology, that you can say, okay, under this situation, this can be prevented. But the problem is that you don't know. There are many different species that are potential hosts, and they have different responses to the environment. No, so we have been basically struggling with that same question for some time since we started discussing this issue. I think that overall, the fact that there is interaction with wildlife doesn't necessarily mean that that the probability of a spillover is going to be higher. And we need to understand a little bit better. But then there are some social economic conditions that can buffer, potentially can buffer that. If you have a population that is in good health status, that is well fed, etc. So poverty can exacerbate the situation and can lead then to people becoming more susceptible to these diseases. So that's one area where you can more or less say, yes, obviously, inequalities and poverty in particular are gonna exacerbate the situation. But I don't have a clear, answer to that question, because this is precisely what we are struggling with. And there is always a tendency to try to generalize. We want to have these like general principles that we can apply. I think that overall, when you have diversified landscapes, you tend, the probabilities of the spillover events will be lower, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be zero. And again, you have a lot of contact, interface between people and wildlife in these areas. So I'm sorry, but I don't have an answer for you.
I think it's incredibly complex, but I do think that looking at things like oil palm or other tropical cash crops that are planted in monoculture is a promising approach, because again, you get these interfaces, the same kind of interfaces. And like you said, if you pick the crops that are high labor, then you've got the combination of potentially an attractive crop that actually attracts the vectors into it from the wild areas and exposes people that are laboring. So I do think that's a really interesting idea to kind of focus on those kinds of crops.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think we can identify some landscapes that are definitely promoting zoonoses, you know.
Mhm.
And what we're doing right now is we're trying to find some empirical evidence for that. You know, there are case studies,
Mhm.
but we want to do a review of the literature to see, you know, if this holds for many different kinds of historical zoonoses and epidemics that have emerged. Where have they emerged? What are the conditions there? What does the landscape look like? And also the socioeconomic conditions as well, because it's not just about the ecology, you know. So I think that by doing that and gathering information on the historic epidemics, that we can get a little bit more informed
Absolutely,
notion
yeah,
of
I think it's
it.
great.
Yeah.
I'm
Thank you,
gonna go
Yvette.
to the next question by Chelsea Goughton. I don't know, Chelsea, if you want to unmute and ask your own question, or if I can read it for you.
Yeah, Hannah, you might need to read it for her because it's not that easy to unmute yourself, actually.
So it's a great question. So I'm gonna put it to the top here. So Chelsea is a PhD student in our cluster, and her question is this: I've heard that scholars are often encouraged by institutions to become an advocate and voice their concerns on these somewhat controversial issues. Yet there seems to be a lack of support after scholars take these actions, especially when they might face negative backlash due to their statements. Can you talk about what supports institutions could provide for these scholar activists to better encourage more activism?
Great. Well, fortunately, I'm in a place when you are in more applied type of schools, like I'm in the School for Environment and Sustainability, and our dean is basically encourage all of us to not necessarily to be activist. He doesn't use that word, but to work with communities to have an impact in the outside world, basically, not to remain in the confines of the academia, no? And I think that is becoming more and more common. And actually, even in the funding agencies, you know, NSF has the broader impact stuff, and they always want you to do stuff that is going to have an impact in the world. I think that that's fine and good, and you know, should be commended. But sometimes it is when you start challenging, you know, the power in society, like, you know, economic power in society, that you get in trouble. and I don't, I mean, I still think it's going to be more difficult. You always take a risk, and it's easier for me as a full professor with tenure, you know, to do this kind of work. And you know, I'm not worried about losing my job. But I think that there are ways in which you can still work with communities and be challenging to the status quo, but maintain, you know, your work as rigorous scientific work, you know. I mean, that's entirely possible. So I think you have to be a little bit careful, but I think that is possible to do it as long as you're producing good science. You know, you can still be active and challenging to the system, and you know, maintain your position.
Great. So I'll follow that with a question from Claudia Pais, who's one of our alumni from our program. And she says, muchísimas gracias, Ivette, for your open eyes presentation. In understanding a balanced and healthy relationship between people and animals, plants, and ecosystems in general, do you see a role in indigenous values and ways of knowing and growing to inform us how we can move forward in this process? And, you know, I chose this will be our last question before we close the webinar, just to kind of like put in tension this conversation about, you know, activism based on rigorous science and activists based on other ways of knowing that don't necessarily follow Western scientific protocols or evidence hypothesis driven questions. And so maybe you could just wrap us up with this question about what is the role of evidence in moving forwards towards more diversified landscapes, and what kind of evidence from Indigenous ways of knowing or other forms of knowing should we as scholars really be engaging more with?
Yeah, no, great question. And, you know, I think it's important to have this, La Vía Campesina call it el diálogo de saberes, or the dialogue between knowledges or wisdoms, or, you know, ways of knowing, basically. And what they talk about is mainly, you know, different people have different ways of knowing and different kinds of knowledge, and there should be this dialogue between these knowledges. But I think it's extremely important to have this diálogo de saberes between scientists and farmers and indigenous people. And obviously indigenous people have a wealth of knowledge. And agroecology has essentially, you know, benefited enormously from that, because a lot of the agricultural practices that are promoted in agroecology come from indigenous knowledge. And I mean, the example that I gave before about the oil palm, for example, in Western Africa, well, throughout Central and Western Africa, oil palm have been cultivated for hundreds of years in these very diverse systems, and they have a lot of different uses for the oil, and you know, there weren't these outbreaks of the disease that, you know, kills thousands of people before. There are many examples of situations where it's not until the landscape changed to a very intensified landscape. People have been cultivating in those landscapes for generations after generations, and then you have the transformation of that landscape, and then that's when you start having diseases. There's, you know, we talk about this in one of the papers that we produced in the pandemic for the people, the Guaranito virus in Venezuela, and the Machupo virus also in Bolivia are two examples of that. And we have a lot to learn still. With regard to zoonosis, we have a lot to learn from indigenous agriculture and indigenous people in general. So this dialogue between scientists and indigenous people, I think, should continue, and maybe, you know, kind of develop also in the area of epidemiology, because, you know, we've been having this dialogue in terms of agricultural management and all that, but in terms of the transmission of disease or prevention of the transmission of disease, and even in treatment of diseases, you know, that's an area that hasn't been explored that much. At least from the perspective of an agroecologist, I think that I haven't seen a lot of that. But yeah, it's extremely important to maintain that communication.
Great. I want to say thank you so much to Ivette for this amazing conversation. I'm going to paste the website for the pandemic research for the people into the chat here, and there's a few questions that we didn't get to, and I'm going to direct folks to that website, because there's actually a lot of really great examples of what communities are doing in relationship to their land and to their communities in relation to these conversations. So thank you so much, Ivette.
Yeah, great.
Hand over to Laura to
thanks for inviting me.
Tell us our parting words, and we'll see you soon.
Yep. Goodbye.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and particularly Ivette for bringing this topic that is so important in these specific times we are all living. And thank you everyone for your participation. We're gonna send an email on Monday with a link to the recording of this seminar, so you can all share this with your colleagues or people that might be interested. And also the information will be at the UBC Farm website. We will write that in the chat right now. And yeah, and for those who are also joining the rest of the cluster symposium that register, let's meet again at 10:10, and we will start our little group discussion. And we just send an email with a reminder on how to connect with the symposium link. And yeah, thank you everyone, and have a lovely day, and we look forward to continue having conversations like this in the future. So with this,
Bye.
have a wonderful
Thank you so
day.
much, Ivette.
Thank you, Ivette.
See you later.
See ya.